Okay, today we're going to read Patty Reed's Doll, Chapter 10, called The Rocky Mountains. It starts on page 74. Westward from Fort Laramie, the oxen pulled the wagons over hills dark and shaggy with wild sage and cactus cruel to their feet. Along the way, we saw the bleaching bones of cattle that had been too exhausted to go on. And when we heard the howl of the wolves and coyotes at night, we realized that they were ready to pounce on any living straggler in this desolate wilderness. The journey that had started out to be such a lark was becoming increasingly wearisome as we dragged along day by day beneath the broiling sun. So that said, the journey that had started out to be such a lark. A lark is like an old school word that means kind of like, something new and something kind of fun and exciting. So she's saying that, it started off, the doll's saying that it started off as something that was new and exciting, and now it's like, all right, are we there yet kind of thing. Sitting by the campfire at night was not so pleasant as it used to be either. Mosquitoes and buffalo gnats made the evenings unbearable, and everyone complained that their sting was much worse than that of the mosquitoes back on the prairie. In addition, the grown-ups seemed to be worried about which road to take. The folks who were going to Oregon would turn off at Greenwood Cutoff, Mr. Reed said. Those who were headed for California had two choices: to go on with the Oregon people as far as Fort Hall and then turn south, or to take the new Hastings Cutoff that was described in Mr. Hastings' book that Uncle George Donner had brought with him. Uncle George read from it. The most direct route for the California immigrants would be to leave the Oregon route about 200 miles east from Fort Hall, thence bearing west-southwest to the Salt Lake, and thence continuing down to the Bay of St. Francisco. This Hastings seems to know what he's talking about, Mr. Reed said. I understand that he has guided several parties across safely. But not by that route, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Donner said. George says the mountain men, Mr. Kleiman, whom you met on the other side of Fort Laramie, advised us not to take it. He did, ma'am, Patty's father answered, but I know Jim Kleiman. He's an ignorant sort. He was in the same regiment with me. Abe Lincoln was in it too, in the Black Hawk War a few years back. He came west after that, and he has been roaming around leading a rough life. Hastings now has had a good education. He's an Ohio lawyer, quite a young man, I believe, and enterprising. His book sounds as if he really knows what he's talking about. I think that's funny because this is Donner saying, didn't that mountain man, Mr. Kleiman, say that Hastings Cutoff is not a good way to go? And Patty's father saying, well, yeah, but Jim Kleiman, he's a rough guy. He's been out here in the wilderness by himself for a long time. Can't trust him. Then there's Hastings, who's a lawyer in Ohio, and he's had an education, so we should trust him. Now, if it were me, I feel like I'd trust the mountain man, even if he is rough, over the lawyer from Ohio, leading my way through to California. Mr. Reed's right, Tamsen, Uncle George said to his wife. Kleiman told us that Mr. Hastings was likely to be waiting up ahead at Fort Bridger to guide the immigrants across. He'd be a good man to tie to, if that's so. Oh, so not only are they following his cutoff, but apparently Mr. Hastings is like right ahead of them, and he's going to be waiting up ahead, and people are willing to join his own group. 300 miles is a big chunk to cut off, and that's what they say the Hastings Cutoff saves, his brother, Uncle Jake Donner, said. So if they take this cutoff that Mr. Hastings recommends, 300 miles less travel, which for a bunch of travelers who are weary and kind of over it, it's very, very tempting, right? Patty and I and the little Donner girls were sitting near their mothers, listening. Mrs. Donner did not seem convinced, and she turned to Patty's mother and shook her head, saying that she thought we ought to stay on the well-known trail instead of trusting some man we don't know, just because he had written a book. Patty's mother said she was sure that the men knew best, and it was very important to get across the mountains as soon as possible. Remembering Grandma's story about the folks who were caught in the snow and almost starved to death crossing the Cumberland Mountains back in Kentucky, my wooden head was inclined to agree with her. We nooned a few days later near Independence Rock. Patty's father pointed it out to us on his map, and we rode over with him while he cut J.F. Reed on its surface, where were carved and painted so other names of immigrants who had passed this way. So on Independence Rock, you can carve your name, apparently. I'm looking at the map in the front. Is Independence Rock on the map? No, bummer. It was on the north side of the Sweetwater River, along which we had been passing. Beyond it were the Sweetwater Mountains, rising abrupt and bare. The peaks were so high they touched the clouds. And Patty asked if we would have to cross them. No, not the Sweetwater Mountains, her father told her, but we shall have to cross the Rockies soon. There will be a pass, however. We have been climbing gradually ever since we left Fort Laramie. On July 17th, while we were toiling up these slopes toward the South Pass of the Rockies, as they called it, a horseman came riding up to meet us. He handed around a letter addressed to all California immigrants now on the road. Mr. Reed read it to the family, and he and the Donner folks seemed pleased at what it said. It urged them all to take the new route south of the Great Salt Lake and promised that the writer himself would be waiting at Fort Bridger to guide them. The signature at the bottom was Lansford W. Hastings. Only 20 wagons continued to Fort Bridger, 100 miles away. The rest turned off to Fort Hall on the road called the Greenwood Cutoff. Colonel Russell and Governor Boggs, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, the Boones, and many others of the companions we had traveled with so far left us here with goodbye and good luck and a cheerful waving of handkerchiefs. Besides all the people from Springfield, the Breens and several other families went our way. Uncle George Donner was elected captain of the little party. The next evening, the 18th of July, we crossed the summit of the Rocky Mountains. This is the Continental Divide, Patty's father told us as we stood on a rocky ledge near our camp and looked back over the ridge we had been climbing. All of the rivers on this side run east towards the Atlantic, and all of the rivers on the west slope flow towards the Pacific. We have come 1,000 miles from Springfield. The snow-capped mountains rising around us were solemn and impressive, and everything was very still. In the west, the sun was setting, and its light touched the rugged peaks with a strange golden glow. "Dolly, we are standing on top of the world," Patty whispered. Our camp was near a stream called Pacific Spring. Mr. Reed pointed it out to us on his map and traced its course into the Green River, which empties into the great Colorado River of the West and flows down to the Gulf of California. Many wagon trains had camped here ahead of us, and the surrounding grass had been much fed down by their cattle. The next day we crossed an arid plain covered with wild sage and dead bunch grass until we came to the Little Sandy River. Here there were thickets of willow trees and sufficient grass for the animals, and on our campgrounds a lupin was blossoming. "It would be good to rest here a day or two, James," Patty's mother said. "Eliza has a heap of washing collected, and this is the first clear water we have seen in a long time." "The rest of the folks seem to feel the same way, Margaret," he answered. "The animals are pretty tuckered out, and it won't hurt a bit to rest and fatten them up for a day or two. In a few more days we'll be at Fort Bridger, where we can do a little trading and get some blacksmithing done on the wagons." While washing blossomed on the willow bushes, the younger children went wading in the cold, clear river, and their big brothers went in for a swim. Everyone was in good spirits, for we were close to the end of our journey. Less than 300 miles from California, they all said, and Mr. Hastings is waiting at Fort Bridger to guide us there. I'd be excited.